Welcome, everyone, to Second Breakfast, our delve into defense tech. We'll see. We've got Justin McIntosh, Choney Stark, and Eric E. Lee because everything has to get rebranded Confederate nowadays. Tony, I really enjoyed your new piece on the challenges of modern combined arms operation. Why don't you give us the take here?
For those who haven't read the article yet, it's basically explaining like the modern challenges of the combined arms breach, which is in maneuver warfare, i.e., like what you think of typical infantry and tanks warfare. Like it is the hardest problem set because it is highly synchronized. There's a lot of moving pieces, and you're probably attacking a place the enemy expects you to go, and you have to do it in a very quick amount of time. If we're going to talk about like what is the role of like kind of the new startups, what is the role of new technology in the defense space, like this is a problem of mass. You have to get so much stuff through a small point, and you have to be willing to accept a lot of casualties to do it. That is the perfect space for autonomy as it currently stands. That is what the Army is trying to go after. It's what Ukraine's trying to go after when you see them stand up these like robotics units. Like the autonomy is not quite there for them to do like, hey, full scale like maneuver warfare. But if you're like, go in this box, go through the minefield, open a lane, and get everybody else through because you're about to lose 80% of what you put in that box, like that is the perfect role for what defense tech companies can do right now.
There's the term relative superiority. McRaven used it, and McRaven in his book on special operations, he wrote about how one of the hallmarks of a special operation raid, we'll say, is that they can, with a small force, achieve through surprise and violence of action, and daring, they can achieve a relative superiority against a stronger force and achieve strategic goals. You can argue about what's the difference between a strategic and a tactical goal, and if SOF ever actually crosses over into that. There's a whole litany of reasons that people disagree with that. But the fundamental thing is that where we buy things in autonomy is as a nation of 300 million people with adversaries that are considerably larger and militaries that are considerably larger. It becomes exactly like Tony's saying, we can concentrate with autonomy to then seize that relative superiority at key positions. That's the only way it's going to work, especially if both nations start to autonomize at the same time. It becomes an outcompete. I hate to use the dirty word replicator, but that's, the theory behind replicator even was block the breach being the strait at this point.
Tony, I guess you're the one out of us four who's written a near future war book. Where are these humans still? There was a great anecdote in the Mike Kaufman podcast where he just come back from the front in Ukraine and was talking about how right now there's kind of like only one guy every kilometer, and it's like usually literally one guy, and for his birthday or wedding anniversary they'll try to like fly him in some sushi, but broadly you've had humans at least on the defensive like very much fall away from like standing in the front like you would imagine in a World War I context. So there's a lot of stuff going on in your and a lot of moving parts in your vision of going into the breach, at least in a ground context. But like, why, if at all, are we still going to need humans within 5 or 10 kilometers of that actual minefield in the near to medium term, at least?
Yeah. So there's a couple ones. One of which is that there's just functions that like machines can't do and they can't replicate, right? Like the command and control amongst different sets of machines is actually really hard. So it's fine when you're like, hey, this one piece of tech works great. Get them all to work together. Super hard if you operate in a contested comms environment. Like humans don't get jammed unless you point a laser at them, which is a war crime. So like there's kind of
enough too. I mean,
so there's like these basic sets, and like to this point of like it's for Ukraine, like they've made a political choice to not draft people below, I believe, the age of 26, right? And like whatever anybody says, like a draft, military draft is a political decision, and like, you know, a lot of the folks in the U.S. agree with it, but it's not our people, it's their people, and so I'll defer to that, right? And so like they have to offset like their manpower advantage, right? I think the average age of a person on the front line in Ukraine is like 39, with the ability to space them out, to only do minimal offensive operations, and to augment with drone forces because they can produce a lot of drones. However, like you can burn a lot of those drones very quickly with very little strategic effect or even tactical effect. And so there's an article in the Texas National Security Review. I forget the guy's name who wrote it. I mentioned it in the article today. But he talks about, you know, in a world in which you have autonomy on autonomy, do humans become the high value assets, right? Because if you destroy 10,000 drones, nobody cares. And so there's, you know, wars, politics by other means, like that makes the human even more valuable on the battlefield. And when the human is brought into the battle, it should actually become a decision point for a commander.
I think the question too becomes when you look at Ukraine in particular, just like the scale that we're looking at, the scale of the border between Russia and Ukraine, the scale of where like the front line kind of is, like that may be, you know, World War I, World War II, Western Front, pushing the Nazis pushing towards Leningrad, but that's different than when we talk about Taiwan. That's different than when we talk about, you know, the line of actual control, where there's only certain spots where there could actually be force on force just because of the terrain and the way that it funnels and channels forces in. And then that then becomes a very different conversation where we're not talking about only having a few humans because everything is just geographically concentrated. And I think that has to be part of the math that the U.S. and the industry is doing when they think through what does combined arms look like. We have the open fields of Ukraine. That looks one way. Does that look the same in an urban environment? Does that look the same in the Himalayas? And I would argue probably no at this point because it is going to require more concentration.
Yeah, Justin, you just hit on my fear in this is that industry, policymakers, observers are running the risk of severe overfit from the Ukraine war, that the prevalence of FPVs and a variety of forms of UAS, given constant observation and effectively supplanting indirect fire in certain cases, it represents maturation in contemporary warfare. But I don't know how much of that is going to be relevant to a fight in Colombia or in Mexico if the United States elects to become more engaged against transnational criminal networks there. Are any of the lessons that we're picking up from the Ukraine front relevant to a crossing of the People's Liberation Army into Taiwan? I'd say probably not. And I don't know that the broader strategic conversation around this moment in warfare and how it's translated by and among policymakers and decision makers at the Pentagon, I just don't know if it's sufficiently sophisticated to recognize that we're getting interesting lessons, but they're not lessons that are universal.
So I think Eric brings up a good point here of like, you know, what about the drone fight in Ukraine, and specifically what about the pitch about drones in the United States carries over to a Taiwan fight? And, you know, there's all this talk about like, you know, China has this massive, production capacity, which it does, right? It has this ability to turn stuff around fast, make it good quality, right, or make it more efficient in ways that perhaps we haven't thought of. Yeah, there's drawbacks, but the point being is like we talk about, all right, here's how we deliver effects against the PLA. Here's how the Ukrainians are able to do it against the Russians. Here's how the Russians are able to do it against the Ukrainians. The PLA has not yet begun to fight when it comes to like autonomous like vehicle production capacity, right? They've spent the last 30 years modernizing to do a very specific thing, which is kill a whole bunch of U.S. Navy warships, right? They have, and they will eventually get around to like changing that, but they've really focused on that in the last 30 years. What does it look like when they say, hey, like The U.S. has done a lot of this. The Ukrainians have done a lot of this. We have fires that are aimed at Taiwan. We have fires that are aimed at the Americans and the Japanese and the Australians, etc. How do we kill the robots? And so at some point they're going to say, we have this massive production capacity and all of these like electronics engineers. Surely we can at least match that. And that is something that I don't think we have figured out what it looks like when we have an autonomy on autonomy fight in the first island chain.
I mean, we're already starting to see the development and the maturation of, like, with just computer vision alone, drones being able to seek other drones. We're seeing that play out. And that, to me, are the lessons that we're learning even slower. Is we're learning the lessons that, oh, we need to have this production capability. That's awesome. That's absolutely where we need to be. But there's also, like, the counter stuff is already happening. That also has to be considered. And we can't invest in yesterday's technology while today's technology is showing us that there are already counters that are being developed. You know, there are companies in the United States that are already working on, like, computer vision based drone interceptors with multiple different pods they can put on them. They can shoot them down or smash into them and kamikaze blow them up. That's not a problem that another industrialized society with a high degree of engineering intelligence and knowledge isn't going to also be able to solve. Then we get back to human mass, because again, once we've knocked out all the drones, we're back to human mass, and we got to have humans. So again, we can't learn. I think, Tony, you're the one who said it. I had a guy from Android promise me that pretty soon we'd only have robots doing the infantry job. And it's like, that's not going to be a reality. Or if it is a reality, it's not a good one. Because it means that it's just, then it is just spheres of influence, and you stay where you are and I stay where I are, because everything else is going to be a standstill if we put it against each other. And the great powers are just going to have their own spheres and put their robots on their borders, and everybody stop. Again, very dystopian. There's your dystopian lead-in.
Yeah, until we get the autonomous robot assassins to take out your president. Anyways, for more, check out X Supra. Yeah. Oh yeah, the nano drones also.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's not forget about those.
My kids watched Ant-Man for the first time recently, and they were like, "That would be amazing." No, that would be terrible.
Dad, why don't you work for the Ant-Man company?
Yeah, exactly. Is this a thing? It is the beauty of getting to watch all of the Marvel movies for the first time with a 7-year-old. We just last week watched, let him watch Infinity War. He's finally worked his way to it. And the look on his face when everybody disappears, cinema at its finest.
I was going to say, I think that's a pretty good pivot to talking about AGI nihilism.
Great. So Palmer Luckey, our Lord and Savior, headed out to Taipei to speak it at a commencement. Nice gesture. Appreciate it. And he gave a really interesting speech, which was kind of like the maximalist version of the lessons from Ukraine applied to the Taiwan context, being this sort of future of war where it really is drones doing the work. He says, I want you to close your eyes and imagine a scenario. In 2029, Xi Jinping orders an invasion of Taiwan. Interesting, he pushes it out to 2029. We used to talk 2027, but but after years of preparation with support from strong allies and powerful partners, Taiwan is ready. Thousands of AI-powered drones spring toward the incoming Chinese fleet. Autonomous submarine systems and surface craft emerge from the sea to protect the island. Like kaiju, he didn't say that. Mass-producible missiles crowd the skies over Taiwan, stopping hundreds of Chinese fighter jets. The day is won. The military that the CCP spent decades to develop for that singular purpose, invading Taiwan, is destroyed for a generation, with Xi's so-called Chinese dream dead with it. Okay. I'm not sure I'm buying his novel, but it's good conversation fodder. I think
give the Air Force 25,000 LRASMs and you get to enable the facilities in Guam, Tinian, and southern Japan to hold the line. I mean, you get the same effect. You don't need AI, but Yes.
Yeah, yeah, but do we get technomancers with that, Eric? Come on.
Well, you put that many.
So perhaps I should offer with
my.
I should open with my one critique of and I would say admitted critique of the primes. The primes are willing to say this if you talk to them, which is that like, there's a limit to how much we can build because our investors like having a backlog. Like when you are a publicly traded company, having that saying that for the next 3 years we're going to be able to keep building stuff, like that is, and it's. I think it's too mundane for people to understand of like, oh, the primes are just old and antiquated. No, the exquisite stuff they build is actually like pretty good. But there are just like kind of broader cultural things that like, that's why you need that stuff. And so that's my like, okay, so that's why you need those things. The thing is like every part of that statement does not take into account what we just said about the PLA production of like, none of that is a mention of what does PLA joint firepower strike look like? What does a blockade look like? Does any of that allow the Taiwanese people to have food and water during this blockade? Like, none of that is answered.
I made this argument. I was having a debate / planning session before I retired, working the Indo-Pacific problem. One of the questions I asked was, once we think China has the capability to take the island, why would they not just put the embargo in then and just hold the line until Taiwan submits? Because that's really the thing, right? It's like once I think I can do it by force, now I don't have to. Because once I can do it by force, I can use all these other means to force you to because I have the backup. And I agree with that. It's just one of those things where it's like, it envisions this, there's a D-Day scenario and we're going to beat the Allies off the beaches of Normandy and Germany survives. Well, the truth is, they would have just come back the next day. Like they would have continued coming, and it only gets worse for Taiwan in those cases. So like, how do you get it to where Taiwan is never at the point where they can be embargoed to the point where where China feels like they can win the day? Well, I think that's back to Eric's point. You have a very strong forward American presence that can counterbalance it, that has the ability to employ its joint, strike firepower packages to then stop that. And it becomes more than Taiwan defending itself from, Western Taiwan.
No,
I think.
But going back to Lucky's commentary, he's envisioning the shorthand of porcupine theory. There is this open question over Taiwanese defense priorities that if you truly want to go back to Thomas Schelling and think about a deterrence posture, buying blue water vessels for the Taiwanese Navy is irresponsible because the Taiwanese will break their hulls and put their keels underwater permanently within the first 18 hours of any conflict. So they are setting money on fire. The alternative is like resilience. It's short range air defense. It's longer range air defense. It's maintaining redundancy for their electromagnetic spectrum. It's anti-ship cruise missiles. It's javelin systems that their procurement it looks something like that of Italy, where Italy has a really excellent blue water navy and expeditionary capacity, and Italy is also bound entirely by friendly countries. But the Taiwanese model for defense procurement assumes a different geopolitical reality under which they have to serve. At least Luckey, to his credit, is speaking about doing something different rather than trying to be like a normal country. And Taiwan certainly is not among the normal countries that we have or that we can envision. So I am not ready to turn it all over to autonomous systems. I think that the key questions around Taiwan defense are grand strategic, like whether or not the United States can fight from Japanese bases, or to whether or not the United States is going to fight at all. But then the third component is, what does an actual defense look like? That is an interesting conversation on its own, and it is not purchasing a blue water navy for Taiwan. It's maybe not even fixed wing aircraft at this point.
I
that
definitely
are,
would not
human
give them
piloted.
any
Like,
more fixed
having
wing air.
yeah. So right, like there you have it. Like I don't know that I'm being particularly controversial, and I hate criticizing a country with a knife to its throat, but their defense priorities through 2029 should probably reflect the nature of the threat that they can expect to emerge at 2029 or 2030, not an imagined threat that they would prefer to fight.
Yeah. So I think 30 seconds of Taiwanese politics before we get back to the AGI as a savior question, right? Is that I think and I've been told like firsthand reliably that like a lot of the U.S. government does not understand that the KMT and the DPP are not the same entity, and that they have wildly different priorities, to which some of my China hand friends might argue the KMT has been co-opted by the CCP, and so like it's not like a budget battle here where like the debate is the budget going to be $850 or $900 billion, but we all agreed broadly that like this is the the national security imperative, right? We're going to buy 100 or 500 Tomahawks. There the difference is like, well, we should keep buying these tanks and airplanes because they look really nice and it makes our generals happy and they're all KMT. And by the way, we like Beijing, like versus the DPP who are like, please don't let them come here. We will buy everything necessary for an asymmetric strategy. And unfortunately, I think it was June or July when the last recall elections were, like the DPP did not do well. I think they tried to recall, 24 KMT legislative officials. I think everyone failed. And that's like Beijing is very happy about that. It's not good for us because we probably have to reevaluate how much we can rely on selling to the Taiwanese versus just augmenting with our own forces.
There are definitely huge swaths of the country, the whole eastern half, the Pacific facing side of the island is largely KNT. And it's the less populated side, but it doesn't change the fact that they have a vested interest in peace. That's what the KMT will tell you. It's a vested interest in peace. Like we need to have a relationship with our nearest partner. But you're absolutely right. Like, I mean, you even go and look at their training areas that are there in Taiwan, and there's open ranges that just shoot out into the sea, and they're just shooting munitions out into the strait. And it's, again, you go back to what is a show of force, or what is the illusion of having a military capability, and then what is actually having a military capability. Luckey is right. Like they do need to have an actual real military threat. And that does not look like a normal, we'll call it, military, because it can't, because they don't have the people, they don't have the resources, and their enemy is not, they're just not going to be in the position to have them. To Eric's point about like, if America can defend from Japan or from, can we get Guam? Can we get past the IDL? Where is the first island chain, border that we can or can't cross? Deep issues that honestly probably play into the KMT's hands when they're sitting down and having these conversations, and they're like, we don't even know if they're going to be here. So yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I don't envy anybody in Taiwan having been there, the problem set that they are faced with, but they're definitely facing it kind of one step forward, one step back in a lot of ways.
And, I'll give Palmer Luckey credit for, imagining a sort of like operational vision of victory, and it's kind of like, groping towards like what doctrine is going to end up having to look like to deal with what war is going to be a few years from now. And this I would set in contrast to a lot of the leaders of the AI labs who are not defense professionals, but have this vision of a decisive strategic advantage where like AGI will come and then America will just be able to like have its way in the world, which, by the way, even when we did have nuclear weapons and no one else had, we still didn't get to, save Poland or win the war in keep North Korea from being communist.
I guess what I'm going to say here is that like this idea that once you have an AGI, that is the sole AGI, don't worry about anything else. One, we've seen that like with Chinese AI models, one, they're picking up pace. Who knows how many chips they just imported that are going to make it even better. And like that is a very, very serious problem of like, if we're assuming that once we hit that finish line, if you call it a finish line, I would call it the finish line in a, Justin would understand it, a untimed or, no marked distance run of like, okay, let's see how far you keep going after. Like if we get it 6 months later, the Chinese have it, and then, the Russians rip off the model, the Indians rip off the model, the Brits develop a model, right? And like, are we one to assume that those models are actually like omnipotent and everything else, which I would argue no. Like our data is polluted enough. There's no way that if we build an AGI model, it won't probably be insane, as will everyone else's. And so you have a decision point of like, well, it's going to be caught between the sides that listen to the AGI no matter what, and the sides that are like, I don't know. So I think you might end up seeing that sort of split. But when it comes to, AGI and warfare, like, yeah, you're just going to build another one, and you're going to have this race of what is your fusion bomb marginally look better, with the difference being is that it was a lot harder back in the day to like screw with the data going into a fusion bomb test versus an AGI. And, I'm going to make one last plug of like, everyone should watch Person of Interest, because it's actually the only television show that like actually shows what it's like to have two competing ASIs.
This is a lesson Ed Lutwack taught me in his like logic of strategy or strategy of logic. I forget what the title, but basically the idea that like the more impressive your technological development is, like the shelf life, like the shorter the shelf life is, because if you have a technological peer, or relative peer, then they're going to sort of devote a lot more engineering and doctrinal energy to copying the thing, countering the thing, solving for the thing, or just like adjusting around it. And so it's rarely just like, and oftentimes in military history, like that thing you thought was the hot shit 6 months or a year from now ends up being this big vulnerability. And I think we can imagine a lot of visions where sort of over-reliance on whatever a powerful AI or a hard takeoff AI can give you actually opens you up in new ways that you weren't necessarily considering upfront.
And we have a very recent test case of that, our air campaign against the Iranian nuclear program. We used our most exquisite weapon systems to hit 3 different targets, and now every hard target engineer in North Korea, in Russia, in Iran, in the PRC know exactly what kind of penetration we can achieve with a conventional warhead. So we had this theoretic fleeting being, this known tool that had unknown capabilities, and we have now declared what those capabilities are to every adversary globally. So that technological development is now less valuable, and it is diminishing because we've now employed it. And that's a constant hazard, and that basic principle applies to any decision science that we attempt to integrate into warfare as well.
There was a flight of something that came from the PRC and turned off its transponder and landed in Tehran prior to those strikes occurring. What data did it gather? What was, there are theories, we could go conspiracy theory, but let's say it was something to do with their air radar defense to see if they could see a B-2 bomber flying it. Not to defend it, maybe not even to tell the Iranians it was coming, but just to see if they could see it.
Yeah. Just to see what the radiation looked like.
See what it looks like based on this system that we have that's now tested. And then we feed that data into everything we have now so that in the future, B-2 bomber, we know what its signature looks like.
And they're monitoring they're monitoring the tanker orbits so they know what that pattern looks like. And now they can look at a forecast. And again, it's not to say that hitting the Iranians was bad. Like that's a separate discussion. It's that now an exquisite technique is now exposed, and it is of less value.
Yeah, and I think when you just take that the exact way that we kind of break that down and we think through that problem, we apply that to AGI, they still have to be able to do stuff in the real world. Those things are all going to have signals and markers, and they're going to lead to things like that's where the nihilism really, to me, I don't understand it. We get AGI, something profit. It's the South Park meme all over again, like the underpants gnomes. I don't know what that second step is that means now AGI is super powerful and we don't have to worry about anything. Because I imagine it still has to build some form of factory and produce a thing that then we use in a military application. There are a lot of other steps that have to go on, and like, yeah, just to Eric's point, I just don't think it can be a save all. And every time we've thought we've got the next technology, it's the end of history. We're proven wrong. So
Yeah, people have been saying that since the crossbow was deployed in the Warring States period.
We already got a movie rec. We got a TV rec. We need some books. Come on, this is a podcast of culture. What do you guys got for me?
Oh, Apple in China for sure. If you haven't read it yet, everyone should read it. It makes Tim Cook look like the worst human being on the planet. But really, it shows like how a company gets captured, even when well-meaning, or in this case, probably not well-meaning, but like how it's just this collection of decisions, and we're finally far enough from when U.S. companies really moved to China to finally get a full sight picture of like, God, you're looking at it, and it's like a slow horror story of like, don't go in the basement, don't go in the basement. You went in the basement.
Interesting applications at the Defense Innovation Unit. They brought in the person who was instrumental to that process to then try and fix the United States.
Yeah.
I guess that's a form of red theming.
Doug Beck, you're welcome to come on ChinaTalk anytime.
That was a characterization without charity. I should be kinder to people who aren't here to.
He could be making a lot more money doing something else. You give the guy some credit. He's not in Detachment 201. All right, he's doing the thing.
No, that's a really good point. Like, there's this entire architecture of hiring opportunities, and they're bringing in authentic talent from American industry and academia to try and solve these problems. And they don't like give them a bunch of jump wings and be like, "Hey, you guys are elite."
Yeah, it's like if you gave enough of a shit. Like,
yeah, it's like
we could find a job for you.
I'm of a certain age where like my formative professional experiences were in Baghdad, and I remember trying to get Iraqi police to like do like the basic functions of contemporary security. And I was 23 years old, and what did I know about it? But what I did know is that there was this curious habit among Iraqi commando units where they would buy maroon berets and jump wings and consider themselves elite. Mm-hmm. And it was a marker of how to like put on somebody else's cologne and you become that person. And I think something I've liked about being around the American military for now, like almost 25 years personally, because like I started ROTC in the summer of 2000. I like the fact that you don't get to do that you can't put military freefall wings on your uniform and then go to a special missions unit. You don't do that in our system. And when we do break down obstacles to excellence, and we do give people the ornamentation of accomplishment and experience, it erodes the entire system.
When I go over and I work with the Jordanians or the Thailand, military in Thailand or whatever, the reoccurring theme is they're not expeditionary militaries. They're internal police, they're security forces on the inside. So what you run into is this, they want to ape, special forces, Navy SEALs, CAG, or, Delta Force. So they buy shooter's gloves and they have great optics and they, all want to go do free fall. And that's all great. It's really cool. But it isn't actually what your job is. Your job is to provide security on the corner, in downtown Beirut. If you're in the Mukafaha, their intelligence, unit, it's kind of the same thing with this Detachment 201. Like, your job is not to be a lieutenant colonel. Your job is to be a guy who knows tech and then can funnel that in. And to be quite frank, a lieutenant colonel gets coffee in the Pentagon. So like, that's not even a good rank to make them.
Yeah.
This does bring up a separate point of we should have a full discussion about security cooperation, because I think the whole like mirroring the U.S. versus what is actually effective is worth an entire episode.
Yeah, I would love to do that. I think it's a passion project of mine for 20 years. So,
All right, we're gonna keep them wanting more, but I'm gonna close with my book recommendation because it's provided me a lot of perverse joy over the past week on the psychology of military incompetence. It's this British World War II veteran who served, I think, for like 10 years, so 1940 through to 1950. Then he got a psych degree. And like after being a practicing psychologist for 10 years was like, generals, man, they're just like us. And the first half of the book is incredibly stylishly written march through all of like British generals and admirals making terrible decisions, going all the way from like the charge of the Light Brigade through to defense of Singapore and whatnot. And he just like takes no prisoners, but also kind of humanizes these people because you're like, look, yeah, at the end of the day, if you're a person, you get tired or you're kind of stressed out or your pride's on the line, or like, by the way, your brother-in-law who you think is a total asshole is your commanding officer. And it just like becomes a big mess. He has this little vignette at the beginning where he's like, this is back in 1976. Like, why can't we just have computers do all of this? His answer is because we need men to be inspired. Like, I think AIs are going to be pretty inspiring at the not too distant future. But I do want to read this passage, which maybe we can close on, which also kind of inspired me at least to get this crew together, talking about Liddell Hart. Liddell Hart's army career was prematurely cut short by the military establishment. Here was a man who was cultured, fluid, lucid, highly intelligent, and in a rare combination, a soldier who was also a first-class military historian, one whose advice on military matters was frequently sought out by civilian leaders such as Winston Churchill. Here was a man whose views and writings were eagerly studied and acted upon by many foreign powers, including Germany, Russia, France, and Israel, whose prophecies in the military sphere were borne out time and time again, and who lived to see his ideas on mechanization and tank tactics used against us by Germany in 1940. But here was a man so deplored by the British military establishment that Lord Gort, chief of the imperial staff at the outbreak of the war, felt moved to say during a lecture to 400 officers of the territorial army, quote, kindly remember that Liddell Hart does not occupy a room in the War Office. So as we are bullshitting on this podcast and on Substack, it's good to remember that not all ideas come from not all the best ideas come from inside the building. Thanks everyone for being a part of Second Breakfast, and I hope you guys like it. I had a ton of fun here. Looking forward to more editions.
Yeah, thanks, Rory.
So that was actually the second half of our recording, which I thought came out a little better than the first half. But if you would like to hear some takes on Detachment 201, the Office of Strategic Capital, and the MP Materials deal, feel free to listen on.
Justin's going to kick us off with Detachment 201.
Early July, 6 executives from Palantir, Meta, a couple of other companies, I think OpenAI's CTO, all commissioned into the Army, and they're commissioned in as lieutenant colonels in the Army National Guard in a thing called Detachment 201. The idea behind it is they're going to commission, and then from inside the department, they will be able to provide their expertise in tech to acquisitions and commanders to help inform procurement and making procurement more rapid.
And how does it really make you feel, Justin?
Well, I mean, like every one of the people who's joined so far is a member of the prime defense contractor, with the exception of Meta, who says they're not a prime defense contractor, but has, tangentially supported or subcontracted on. It does become hard. You're going to advise the department on procurement, and you are also the provider who is in several cases beholden to shareholders for your bottom line, and part of that comes out of your ability to sell to the department. So I don't know. Obviously there's something there that doesn't. It could be nothing, but it feels self-interested in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'm curious why Department of the Army didn't create SGE, special government employee positions, or HQE positions, highly qualified employee, or bring them in as a Schedule C. Like, before I even assess the merits of any of these 4 individuals coming into the department, which could be entirely valid, like there's active pathways beyond like punching them in as an O5 and giving them like a beret and a soft cap and saying, you're now part of the force. Like, there's a degree of artificiality here that I haven't seen fully explained. And I don't know why being a civil servant is insufficient to solve these challenges. It does feel sort of like putting on somebody else's cologne and saying, no, I'm a warfighter now. And that is suspicious.
And so, like, we've had pipelines in the past set up in the last few years for, like, specifically for hackers, usually, of like, or, you know, for doctors, et cetera, of like, hey, you have this expertise, you know, if we bring you in as like an 0102, like we normally would, like, your pay is not going to match. Nobody's going to want to join. Hey, we can commission you up to an 05. You still have to go through the training. The thing is, nobody was doing that. Like, that was the thing. Like, there was this belief the impediment was the pay. And then really nobody, I actually think the numbers are literally in the single digits of folks who did that program.
NSA was hiring the same bodies at GS15 Step 10 to start. Like, if you got the chops, you're going to go into TAO and work there rather than at Cyber Command at Fort Stewart or something.
Regardless of the conflict of interests and kind of, you know, showy nature of it, I think we had multiple blog posts from these executives like talking about how proud they are to be serving in this way. I mean, this is like a far cry from what we, you know, were dealing with in the Project Maven days, right? With Google pulling out. I mean, the idea that you could quote unquote like get away with something like this. And again, you know, some of these folks are defense contractors, but like OpenAI, yeah, they have, this is not like their entire business. And the same thing with Meta, where it's very much an ancillary thing. And I think the fact that this is now like a cool thing to do, and it's not something that's going to like prompt a revolt within your, you know, within your company is just an interesting moment in time. And it may shift even harder one way or the other, but it's a good like kind of sense check in like August 2025 with a very controversial president that no one within these companies really seems to be up in arms or like, you know, quitting over the fact that their president or CTO is now going to spend their weekends on a army base.
201 is another attempt of the Defense Department to do bank shots for acquisition reform, that they're bringing in people who come from nimble startups or Silicon Valley software services that move fast and buy and sell aggressively like that. They're trying to effectively conduct an acqui-hire in Silicon Valley terms of certain talent. But that's not new. There's the Defense Innovation Unit. There's the Air Force's version. There's AFWorks. There's Naval X. There's SpaceWorks, Army Applications Lab, Office of Strategic Capital. There's a host of institutions created in the past decade that are all designed to try and get the American economy around the proclivities of the federal acquisition regulation. It's all elements of jury rigging or putting duct tape on a system that I think everybody kind of whispers around or shouts from time to time, says isn't functioning. But acquisitions reform is the heart of the challenge. And we keep on like putting these satellites into orbit around the core problem. And, you know, 4 lieutenants colonel isn't going to solve much on its own.
Well, and with that, maybe we can turn to the latest legislation that, you know, is now throwing a good chunk of change over to the Pentagon.
Yeah,
Defense.
I mean, well, I don't think it quite accomplished acquisitions reform, to Eric's point. I think, you know, in some ways the Pentagon is going in the right direction of like, hey, we need to have looser ways that we can spend money that are not tied to the world's strictest requirements where everything's over-engineered. Like, to that point, I get it, and it's good. The problem is that when you throw that much money at a problem in a single year, there's no way you're replicating that year after year. And the one thing you will hear from defense primes and even from new startups, like as time goes on, is our investors need to hear consistent funds. And so if the difference is between a 5% increase for 1 year and then it teeters off for the next 5, or if you get, 1 to 2% over the next 5 years, most people would take the 1 to 2% over the next 5 years because that's, a pretty steady guarantee. Like, they need to see those signals. Ukraine was the first signal we got in a long time that we need to build more, right? That was the first time in a long time that companies like Raytheon could do third shifts to build stuff, right? They could bring in more workers. They could go beyond the minimal sustaining rate. So, it's a single good sign, but I really doubt, especially with the politics around it, that you're going to be able to replicate that, year after year. And you're still not fixing the CR issue, right? Like, we're still probably going to be in a CR for 3 to 6 months. We're going to crash all this money at the end of those 6 months, and it's chaos upon chaos upon chaos. And that's where, it goes from a DoD problem to a national policy level problem of if you can't determine consistent funding, if you can't do this thing where you're actually going to pay for a full 12 months of budget in those 12 months, then nothing actually gets fixed.
I spent 20 years in, and I think over that time, there were only 6 budgets on time in 20 years. And the majority of the time, travel, and when I say travel, this isn't going out to training. This is, deployed. You're not getting paid. Your paycheck's coming in, but your travel card's not getting paid. Use of funds, and that can be delayed 30, 60, 90 days. And it has, ancillary impacts on training and readiness. All of that swings in and swings over to procurement because, again, every one of these stoppage points is, okay, now we can't touch this program that we've been developing an exquisitely engineered solution for. And it pushes everything down the road. I think Tony's point's great. The DoD has tried to do a lot. 2022, they Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and or for R&E, came up with the AppFit program, which is a program to put up to $50 million into defense tech startups, non-traditional defense contractors and small businesses to be able to get them through the valley of death. But it was a one shot. You were going to get one shot of funding up to $50 million through the cap of the way the legislation is written. We've never gone back and come and really said hey, we need to plus this up and have some way of saying, with metrics, okay, you took this first $30 million and you got this increased capacity and capability. This was what that then turned into over time, and how we then improve production and procurement through that process. Because there's still no streamlined process and no, authorization to use memorandums and everything that come out of that process. Those are all ancillary. So you still get stymied by kind of the bureaucracies of the FAR, even when you're trying to be innovative within the Department of Defense's systems.
And not to peel too far off from legislative action, because I think there's really compelling stuff happening around the 2026 NDAA. And the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was a transformational investment in Department of Defense, especially around Office of the Strategic Capital. There's something that happens that's legislative adjacent that gets to the problem Tony elevated. Just about a month ago, MP Materials announced a transaction with the Department of Defense. And, I was out of the Department of Defense at the time, going back into private practice. According to my sources, this deal sort of came out of a black box. What I understand is that the Deputy Secretary of Defense effectively employed his robust Rolodex to pull this transaction together. And there's a couple of interesting components about it. One, there's a purchase of $400 million of preferred stock of the company from the Department of Defense. DoD doesn't do that. All of a sudden, the Department of Defense is a preferred stockholder in a critical minerals process. The federal government has taken stock positions in companies before, like in the airline bailouts or TARP after the global financial crisis. But this is new. There was a $150 million loan from the Office of Strategic Capital, where I used to work. That was a core component of the deal. But there was another layer through the Defense Production Act where the Defense Department set out a price floor for mineral production. they guaranteed a price for commercial offtake. And ultimately, this one deal, this MP Materials deal, gives American or really international private companies a template for how to interact with the federal government and how to go out and get those price floors or those production guarantees that are typically torn to shreds through continuing resolutions or the proclivities of appropriations. So the advantage is we've got an entirely valid project. American critical mineral processing probably needs to take place in a friendlier location than the People's Republic of China. Like, that's a safe assumption. The merits of the transaction are there. The hazard here is that there is now a template for success that American international industry can look towards, but the way of pulling it together was just a guy from Cerberus successfully leaning on his professional network to pull it together. So whether it can be replicated, whether it can be done at scale is still uncertain. But now what I'm witnessing in conversations with a vast swath of American industry and people saying, how do I make this happen for me? And the federal government has yet to really spell that out, because they've solved a problem for one company, but now there's scores of other companies that have the same exact challenge and want that kind of discrete achievement.
I was very excited by this minerals deal. I thought it was super cool, super creative. And yeah, Eric, why don't you talk a little bit more about just like how much more powder OSC is going to have to do more of this stuff going forward?
Yeah. So when the deal was announced on the 11th, I reached out to some people who are still in the game, so to speak. And like, is OSC taking the equity? Because right now, statutorily speaking, Office of Strategic Capital is principally speaking a debt shop. Like, they do direct loans. They don't go out and buy stock of companies. And the federal government, again, sometimes does that, but it's usually in crisis situations. And if you're interested, you can go into the SEC website, go to Edgar, look up NP Materials, and they give you the full deal deck. And it's really extraordinary that they disclose to the public that said, hey, we're using a novel interpretation of the Defense Production Act in order to secure this equity. That they effectively say, we haven't done this before, but we think we're on solid ground. And just yesterday or the day before, the Senate Armed Services Committee elevated a amendment to the Defense Production Act to grant them the authority to use equity purchases. So it looks like people on Capitol Hill are trying to retroactively authorize the Department of Defense to enter into this deal so they can do it more frequently. So what we're witnessing is aggressive interpretation of existing law. Like, Defense Production Act authorities are ancient as far as we're concerned. But the idea of the United States coming in and taking a substantial ownership position of a company as a means of blocking out adversarial capital, whether or not the foreign ownership, control, or influence that can be exerted by hostile countries is out there or not. But to Jordan's prompt, and to return to other legislative activity, in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the Department of Defense, specifically Office of Strategic Capital, got $200 billion of lending authority that it can employ against the technology targets that Congress set out for it. But also, like, half of that is expressly reserved for investments in critical minerals and critical materials. So what's compelling about this moment is we're not just seeing action plans or executive orders coming out of the White House to say, hey, this is an administration priority, because every administration sets out priorities. There's a fusion between and among, really, the White House, Congress, and industry that says, hey, we need this form of federal capital support. We need substantial checks to be written, and we need to go really quickly. And we're starting to see what that looks like with this MP Materials transaction. The X beyond this is, how does the Pentagon continue to sort and assess other opportunities? Because the Pentagon has a debt issuance that was put out last September. They're coming up on a year since its announcement, and they're underwriting that now. So we're going to start seeing what traditional applicants look like once that pipeline is complete. But that was also under a $900 million loan limit. Now that this team has $200 billion to spend, I expect to see their ambition increase accordingly.
Eric, how do you think this compares to the private market and what we're seeing like in terms of changing investment for seed funding, Series A? Because I know some of that's down a lot. Like, do you think that this is just going to be another avenue with probably like same or equivalent quality of investment, or is this going to be different buyers?
To fall back on Office of Strategic Capital, I think when their organization came together at the end of 2022, I think there was a lattice work of good assumptions, good research, and then some really bad assumptions and bad research. That the idea at the time of founding was that there was a lack of investment in the defense industry, that private capital wasn't touching American startups that were trying to operate alongside or in the same market as the defense primes. And to an extent, that was true. I mean, we're still downrange from, we talked about Project Maven, the blow up with Google. And we were still in the world of Web3, where private capital was chasing a market that never quite materialized. If you recall, the Bored Ape Yacht Club was far more interesting than counter UAS for a couple of years. But as OSC matured, as it was able to hire people, as Congress gave it funding, Congress also pointed it in a different direction. I think Congress is also correct that the Senate Armed Services Committee saw that there was maybe not sufficient, but there was plenty of private capital moving towards defense-oriented companies that we can just say it right out loud. Like SpaceX is exceptionally well capitalized. They were not struggling to find private investment to put payloads into orbit. And working under an assumption that defense adjacent activity couldn't attract capital just didn't hold water. But now in mid to late 2025, with better research on hand, with more responsible market analysis being developed at OSC inside R&E at the Pentagon, and more, a healthy exchange with markets. There's a recognition that the Pentagon can be more impactful if it operates in, I don't want to say less exciting industry fields, but industry fields that don't necessarily have the same cachet as companies that are operating in El Segundo or in the Front Range of the Rockies. OSC is starting to direct its attention towards, ball bearing manufacturers or lumber yards that do ultrafine wood pellets. They're looking at the fundamental building blocks of the supply chain, not necessarily the finished product that goes into a cutting edge unmanned aerial system. They are trying to find the right type of permanent bulk magnets that go into the rotor. So what we're
tell me about these
witnessing-
wood pallets.
Oh, so additive manufacturing, like they're not to go down to specific targets, but there are wood mills that produce stuff that you see at Lowe's or Home Depot that, as a side component of their principal lumber product, they make ultrafine, specifically milled wood pellets that go into a variety of different forms of construction and manufacturing. And is that as exciting as putting a guidance package on a Hellfire variant? Maybe not, but it serves as a third or fourth tier component of the supply chains upon which the primes and these new upstarts rely upon. So to conclude this sort of history lesson of industrial policy, I think there's a recognition that at its point of origin, OSC was directed in the wrong market, that what was necessary was not an infusion of federal cash, but there was an attitude and a disposition change. And I think, one, the relative collapse of Web3 enabled it, but two, the expanded war in Ukraine, free campaigns in the Red Sea and throughout the Middle East, and always for the hazard of a major confrontation in the South China Sea over Taiwan, has shifted smart investment to contemporary defense issues. The opportunity remains, and this is where I think OSC and other federal lending programs are intelligently operating, is that there are components of the American economic base that may have never considered themselves to be a segment of the defense industrial base, but they are. And it's attenuated, but what they're doing, the products that they're putting into market, can go to grocers, they can go to Whirlpool, to Harley Davidson, but they can also find their way into Anduril. And that's the opportunity. So this $200 billion slug of cash that OSC has, it's going to take a while to get out because it's not the most nimble of programs. But I think you're going to see investiture coming out of that fund directed in interesting ways, that it's going to be companies that have been operating in like Minnesota doing iron smelting, but doing iron smelting in a really compelling way. And they've been doing it for 85 years. They've never done a Series A. They've never done a Series B. It's just been privately held. And now they want to expand to do something new. So they're finding new partnerships. And I think that's what this future version of OSC is going to look like. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suck all the air out of the room with this rant about federal lending. But I do think that there was this weird assumption, and I saw it when I was working there, that some unscrupulous contractors did truly bizarre research and said that American aerospace and defense was undercapitalized, and that you really needed the federal government to come in with $900 million to like change the world. And there was just like a thematic mismatch. But to the credit, the Trump administration has seen OSC as a vehicle to drive change. So it is not, dumping $50 million into a vertical takeoff and landing taxi cab service that may eventually have some sort of military application. Like, they're not seeding that. They're doing the MP materials deal. They're getting the ability to process rare earth minerals back into the United States. Like, that is strategically transformative. It's not tinkering on the margins of the venture capital industry like it started back in 2022.
Yeah. So I think that goes back to like this concept of like, what is government's role in national security beyond the actual like execution side, right? And I think like Eric, you and I in the past have a lot of conversations about like, what does it mean to do industrial planning correctly? Doing the boring like support stuff that like no like founder wants to do. Like, that is the role of government. That like is as strange as it is to say that yes, the government should be involved in like helping secure minerals and stuff. Yeah, they're supposed to provide the building blocks, right? It is the industrial equivalent of building highways. What you use the highways for is on the private sector.
As an aside, though, I've read books published in 2007 talking about America's like rare earth vulnerability. So the fact that it took like a trade war and a China export ban and us giving them H-20s in order to like get this shit
it took the Red Sea
on the road
is that
a land war in Ukraine and an actual trade war with China to actually get money out the door to bring rare earth materials refining back to the U.S. Well, maybe here's a transition to talk about speaking of like outsourcing things to the private sector, this idea of capabilities as a service, where traditionally, the Defense Department would like buy stuff and then use it. But there is a push apart on the part of the defense tech firms to just say like, no, pay me to like do the thing you want me to do and have that be like the KPI you're judging me on and paying me for, as opposed to like a thing that can go this fast with like this level of reliability or whatever. And people are a little triggered in the chat that a retired General Mike Minahan was proposing transferring retiring KC-10 aircraft to industry.
So I'll open up with, there have been cases in the past where people have made the case of, hey, like, the contractors can do this for cheaper, they can do it, it's easier. And like, a good case study here is like when you create like red forces, right, for war games. So like if you're doing like red pilots or whatever, right, oh, instead of having our guys fly the planes and maintain the planes, we'll pay this company or whatever. And it turns out that's actually more expensive almost in every case, and it's lower quality. It's just, and it goes back to a core principle of like, well, why don't we just have contractors do everything for the military? Why do you need people in uniform? And the question becomes, well, are you going to pay that person $100,000 to go through that breach? No. Okay. What other incentives can you offer? Oh, you can put them in a nice uniform and give them awards. And suddenly you're back to the military, right? And so it's just one of those things where if we did that, where we start to, put, aerial refuelers on the private side, et cetera, it's going to cost more money. It's going to be more of a pain. And at the end of the day, if you want to fly that west of the IDL, you're going to end up having to put them in uniform.
But it's not just that. It's that it's not novel. It's not a novel solution. It is what we do. The reason KBR is a 4-letter word is that that's what they do. I was in Syria. I had a truck that had a bent rod, and these trucks that we're driving around in, these MRAPs and these large RG-33s, they can't be worked on by a normal human. Like, you have to have a contractor come in and work on it. We were in an area where we had been shot at, I had to medically evacuate some guys. The contractors did not want to travel. They wanted me to drive this truck hundreds of kilometers to the safe base where they could then repair it and work on it. And it's because we had already taken all of that capability that existed within the United States military, where we had mechanics that could be mechanics, and we had shifted it over to the private sector. And it gave them control and leverage on military operations. You now had to fit your military operation into private industry's desires to perform. Are we really going to say, okay, this strategic level asset, the KC-10, yeah, we should give that away and let somebody else be the one that controls that? And we have to go ask them to perform. I don't know. Like I said, it's not a novel solution to me.
But it's been probably like 10 years since I really spent any time with Palantir's analytics software. But the attitude then was always that, hey, this analytics software is great. We have our own, which is perfectly good. The challenge with Palantir software is that they would recode your data ingest so you couldn't export it again, and that you had to pay for their text to effectively be part of your order of battle. That, to Justin's point, it often seems like a form of long-term rent-seeking rather than service delivery. None of it's new. The Department of Defense has been leaning on the private sector forever. But shifting critical warfighting functions to the whims of a board of directors is probably inviting unforeseen forms of friction into national security decision making.
No. 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 Four. No. And the thing. No. The or one. Don't. Don't. One. One. No.